Arkadaşlar hoş geldiniz. Güzel bir çalışma olsun arzu ediyoruz inşallah.
We wish that this will be a beneficial seminar for all of us. Participation banking, financing without interest, and whatever you want to call. And we already listened to the previous speaker, and I hope that all the initiatives will render their fruits. Well, my duty is to explain the nature of the contracts in participation banking. I am coming from religious sources, and I will try to explain to you the principles of participation banking. Since May 24, I am in the involved with participation banking, and I'm an ancient participation banker. And when in my lectures, in my presentations, they believe that I'm a banker, and the colleagues are students themselves. So this is how I will be dealing with the details of this issue. In my presentation, with your permission, I will make an introduction, and then I will try to talk about the principles. And obviously, what is the perspective of the participation banking in the religious circles? What do we mean as the principles, and what are the contacts? And I will try to explain what they are and how they are or should be applied on the basis of my 12 years of experience. Dear colleagues, when we see a topic, when we deal with a topic, we should not treat the topic as a theory. And there is a need in the Islamic law and in the Islamic economics. We must concentrate on the needs of the people. And from this perspective, we see that there is a need for banks and banking activities by the individuals, and it is not necessary to explain whether there is a need for banks or not. Yes, you can, in any economic order, people may be starving, or they may be not working. They are not. And this will be my main hypothesis, because the Islamic law is not creating obstacles in front of us. Islamic law is not blocking our development, quite the contrary. They give us many opportunities, but unfortunately we fail to benefit from them. Mr. Osman Akgüz also stated the participation banking and Islamic finance is unable to create new products, it was stated. But the problem lies with us. It is not true that the Islamic theology has set up many obstacles in front of us. No. Also, with regard to conventional banking and also participation banking, they all have the same need, namely they cover a requirement, a need in the society, and therefore both the banking system, conventional banking system, and the participation banking system should grow, and the existing conventional banks are there in order to cover the financing needs of individuals, and they serve the need of the people. Now, I would like to draw your attention on the following issue: the word "need." Yes, the concept of need. We have to. I would like to draw your attention on this issue. Banks do not need to work on the basis of interest. That is not a must. Also, when you look at the banks operating with interest and when you look at the loans they are distributing, you see that this is in order to satisfy a need. Either you want to buy a raw material, or you want to amplify the needs of your business. You want to buy new instruments. You want to your country to go forward, and this is why you need a loan. And this is a basic requirement, and that's the requirement of the individual is covered by the banks. The loan instructions, operations at the banks are legitimate, and they can be converted into interest-free systems. And this will be a very easy and simple move. If interest is considered as haram in the Muslim theology, then we should correct certain ways of operation, which is quite easy. Actually, the banking operations can be harmonized with the interest-free system. Obviously, the basic need is trade. The need for trade, buying and selling, partnerships or lease agreements and other contracts, and they may be also considered for interest-free banking systems as well. Some people say that 95% of the banks are working on interest basis, and the interest-free banks are in the second rank, they say. But the transactions performed by the participation banks and the banks which operate on the basis of interest, and they compare them and they think that the participation banks' principles are in compliance with the Islamic rules. And obviously the main mistakes is to be seen in the contracts that have been prepared and implemented by the participation banks. Well, dear friends, let's look at the contracts in participation banks. We see that there are many contracts like that. For instance, when there is a cars, in the case of a cars, the deed of cars is implemented. For instance, people have private current accounts, and as Zamir Bey stated, the act of cars is implemented. The participation banks can extend cars loans to their customers. And also it is possible to develop new contracts, new forms of contracts. They may the cars loans are short-term, and they also give the possibility of benefiting from cash withdrawals. And also they do lease contracts. And obviously these are the lease contracts, and there can be an interest in this case, namely the lease of the leased safes. Participation banks can give an advance lease, and they can have sub-lease and also contracts with their customers. They do banking services, and an important part of that is on the topic of lease. If you are purchasing a service from a bank, then you have to pay for it, obviously. And this is an interest contract based on mutual benefit. They also have certain partnership agreements. Partnership contracts, and the basic issue here is the participation accounts, and they collect the money in a partnership, and the project financing is also done in the form of a partnership. They also can conduct purchasing and sales contracts, or murabaha acts that we call murabaha, and they also apply the same principles to the credit cards. They also perform financial leasing contracts. They purchase an object, and they can lease that object on the basis of financial leasing. Is this a lease contract, or is it a time sale? Well, I will be commenting on these issues. And they also sell, they also concentrate on the spending trades, like buying and selling gold, or foreign exchange transactions based on a certain period. This is called forward and obvious options. And the participation banks, based on a promise, they can perform foreign exchange transactions as well. And there is another transaction called teverruk, and this is an operation done by funds, or by taking funds, or the operations that they cannot resolve through murabaha, where they can give their own a support, a corporate support, and also teverruk. İstisna is a contract that also are doable by the participation banks, and they are under the guarantee of doing some istisna, and this is also in line with the Islamic rules. Sale and leaseback transactions are applied by the corporations, and it is directed to the losing, in order to find a solution to their monetary difficulties. Obviously, vekalat is applied as well, and mainly in sukuk, and also investment with vekalat can also be applied. And also there is another application. They have a new way of issuing the sukuk, and they also give way to kefalat or other contracts, and they can, or tekafül, and they also have insurance companies agreements, and they can also act as an agency of the individual and personal pension funds. And they use almost all types of contracts applied by the conventional banks. But in our legislation, in our law, there is no specific explanation about all these issues because we compile everything under one single word, namely credit or loan. And the conditions of the contracts are different. They have their own nature, and they are vaporized within the framework of one single word, namely credit. We express the buying and selling transactions as a credit. The exception, obviously, we also try to explain the istisna with the word credit. And actually, this word is evaporating all the background meaning of our transactions and make it similar to the operation of conventional banks, which are based on obtaining some benefit from the loans they extend. However, in my opinion, in the participation banks, whatever we do, every deed that we do, every contract that we perform, we can explain the conditions of these contracts. The Islamic law in this area does not foresee any restrictions. Dear friends, one of our fundamental principles in Islamic finance, the finance without interest rate, the rules are determined by the owner of what we call Islamic, and this is the God Almighty, Allah. We are not talking banking, but banking has its own rational and secular rules, and we were discussing these beforehand. But now there are certain orders that we have received from God, because in the Araf Surah, the interest has been considered as haram, and therefore the contracts have to depend on the approval of the two parties. Whatever you do should not be like a gamble, says the Islamic rules and provisions. So these are the basic rules, but when we enter into details, we see that that there will be a totally new area open for the individuals. Dear friends, in the Islam, actually, the Islamic society, Islamic people are considered as a target. They are the main parameter of the society, and we would like to develop Islamic finance in this environment. The society is 95% Muslim, but we have not created or constructed the Islamic society or the Islamic group until now. We have been working under a secular and rational perspective. and we are trying to do an Islamic banking in this environment, and this is our main difficulty. Actually, the main rule in the Islam, vakıf, sadaka, support, these are all the principles in a society, and this is applied by the Muslim societies, but not fully yet. In the banking sector, this is not the same, because people apply to the banks when they are in need, and if they are not in need, they won't apply. But what we are where we are operating is in the areas where people are in need, and we want to help them. And therefore, in the Bakara Surah, it says that Allah is denying interest rate, and it increases the support, financial support amongst people. Muslims should be in solidarity when they are in difficulty. Secondly, the second important issue is Qarz Hasan. In other words, there should be we should explain a mechanism in the Islamic society where we can be indebted to an individual without an interest, and you can extend a loan to an individual without an interest. This is the rule in order to help each other. And obviously, this is a deed that will limit the working area of the conventional banks. But in the Islamic society, this is the rule. Well, in the Holy Quran, there is a third concept, trade. Interest is totally distinguished, differentiated from trade. Trade is legitimate, and therefore participation bank should be evaluating its assets based on the first principle. And this is how they are acting. In this ayat, we see another answer. Profit, wage, income, or interest, they are taken as similar concepts, not only in the past but also at present. Obviously, the profit taken or paid to the participation banks is nothing different from the interest you pay to the bank against a loan, or the interest you benefit from your time deposit at that bank. Now, but the whole operation in the conventional banks has one single target, namely to get an interest. However, in our sector, the participation banks, they are totally different from the interest dimension of conventional banks. Certain principles in the Islam show the following. In the Islamic law, basically, there is nothing forbidden. Nothing is forbidden at basically. Obviously, in the Islam, everything is legitimate. But when something is forbidden, it should not be applied. Imagine an Islamic lawyer. An Islamic lawyer or professor of law should be, if they answer every question in an affirmative way, he or she might say, yes, this is correct, you can do that. It is doable. And 95% of the cases, these answers will be correct. There is only a margin of 5% when the answer is not correct. Actually, the main issue is that any operation that you are doing has to be in line with the accepted rules of the Islam. You can have time deposits, or you can make transfers, or you can have guarantee contracts, all the other contracts. You can do everything, and there is no restriction, religious restriction on these issues. Well, making halal haram, this is a mistake, a frequent mistake in relation to the participation banks. You want to do a trade under the given conditions within the banking sector. You can have commercial contracts in order to obtain a profit which you want to share with the participating individuals, but based on certain doubts and subjective evaluation, certain circles will judge these deeds negatively, which is really not correct. If you are not destroying the nature of a fundamental contract, then you can do anything. You can update it. For instance, in the contract, you have to abide to the conditions of the contract. If the two sides are in agreement in the implementation of these rules, cannot be considered as wrong or right, because this is the agreement between the two parties. If you are not violating any rule of the Islamic theology or Islamic law, then you are fallible, and but in other circumstances, you can put certain conditions to your contract during the buying and selling period. For instance, let me give you an example. If in a purchasing case, one party pays the amount due to receive a good, and the other party is providing the good. And you can also refrain from delivering the goods without receiving the money, for instance. Or another example, you want to sell a product and you do not want to have any harm on the product. You should not, and you can obviously give this a condition, and that condition may or may not be accepted and approved by the buying party. What I'm trying to say, dear friends, is the following. If the two parties are approving the conditions of a contract without any hesitation, then a third party is not entitled or does not have the right to interfere, as long as certain principles of the Islam are violated. Well, what is important in the implementation of a contract is to abide by the rules and principles of that contract. In order to say that a contract is not valid, we should have complete and fundamental proof. For instance, in the case of financial leasing, in this case, the person who the lessee has to provide all the duties given to it, the responsibilities, and if the product is lost, the responsibility lies with the lessee, and the financial leasing contract has been established with these conditions, and if the two parties have agreed and approved that contract under these conditions, you can never call that contract as valid. Validity is the most important issue here.
The main principle in contracts is facilitation. One needs to facilitate this effort. In other words, if it's complicated to execute a contract, this will not be a desirable situation. The aim here is to ensure that contracts should be done in the easiest way possible. This should be or could be done on the internet through the use of credit cards or through the banking system. So it is not possible, of course, for us to transform a contract in its form, which is 1,000 years old, to today. We need to innovate, and the Islamic law is actually very open to such development, such progress. So it does not introduce any constraint on us. Changing of time means that conditions and circumstances will change. That too is also very important, because if we have a contract which is based on certain times and locations, then it is possible to consider change, because there is a broad case law in Islamic law, and contracts fall within that broad interpretation. It is not appropriate to establish unchangeable laws in trade relations, and that's why in Islamic law too, it has always been the policy to refrain from absolute and binding provisions. Necessity renders some difficult things or some issues which are not acceptable. So what is important here is not the theory, it's the needs of the people. Let's say people are unemployed, they do not have any food, and we have a wonderful theory, but it doesn't help them. Well, that's not going to work. If you have a good theory, then that good theory should be a theory which should also meet the needs of the people. And if it doesn't, that means there's a problem there. So here what is meant is that if there is a necessity, but there's no time, I won't go into the details of this, but if there is any necessity, then you can do certain things and they would be considered mubah. And if there is a need, therefore, certain things can be done. And people only take on responsibilities and orders which they can do, because Allah does not order them to do things they cannot achieve or do. Now, I didn't know who was going to attend this meeting. I understand that there are no Islamic lawyers, but I do want to speak of one other principle here, which is about the purpose, because provisions have to follow purpose. When you conduct or execute a contract, you have a certain purpose. There's a goal, and that goal could be earning some lease income or service returns or other trade income. There is nothing wrong with that. But if you would like to achieve interests income, then the form is not important anymore. That's the only one case which is separate. And I have a short explanation here, a legal explanation on this. And I say here is that this rule should be considered in conjunction with all the other principles which I have just cited. And we should not be under the wrong impression that they actually actually aim to gain income. You may have a large organization, an enterprise, and it may have branches, and it may be doing a lot of work, and people may be contacting you every day to carry out business. You may be buying, selling, leasing, or you may be doing some istisna contracts or other things which contribute to production. Trade is halal, and it can change, it can innovate itself. The contracts may change, they may become easier, they may be combined, their conditions and terms may be updated, and contracts are subject to the consent of the parties, and that they have the freedom to determine the conditions of these contracts. So there may be new forms of contracts. Financial leasing is one such contract, credit cards is another one, and these promise-based processes, which are futures transactions. These are all things which are important because they provide you access to cash, to money, which is what companies need. That's why we need to have certain solutions which can cater to these needs. And we have to change and develop our contracts accordingly. And this is the thing that we're not doing. This is what we are missing. We need to come up with new contracts, and these new contracts will be important in that they can help us adjust to the needs of the day. And there's no problem with doing that. There would be employment, there would be benefits from these activities, and these are the kinds of things that we have to focus on. And these, and we cannot really simplify everything by saying that everything is based on interest, and then we cannot consider it haram as such. We really have to focus more on these issues. I want to touch upon a couple of other points. Now, the maturity and the delay charges are acceptable. In other words, in trade, you can have delayed deferred payment, and this can add to your income, and this is something that should be acceptable. This is the basic point on which the participation banks rest. We are looking at our commercial transactions and are trying to expand it over a period of time, and this is the basis of our financing, the source of our financing. When people are not able to pay something in advance, they should have the opportunity to expand this period of payment, and this is very appropriate and is considered acceptable in Islamic law. So it is possible to provide the same product at different prices based on installments, the number of installments. Let's say if you have a product which is 1,000 lira, then that may be the price for 6 months, and for a year the price could be 1,500, and in such a case such a process would be acceptable, and this is something that our Directorate of Religious Affairs has also agreed to. Inflation difference is also halal. We should also speak about this. There have been a lot of discussion on this one, not on the previous one, but we see some discussion about this one. And we might say that on the issue of the inflation difference, there is a consensus today that this is acceptable. So when you extend money as debt, when you provide cars, then you can affect the difference in the rate of inflation. This meeting here aims at new products, at innovation. So as I say in my lectures, there could be a product based on this difference in the rate of inflation, because participation banks may provide such services to their loyal customers. They provide Karz-ı Hasen's benevolent loans to their customers for 3 days, 5 days, whereas they could also provide other such transactions for 2-3 months, which could be based on the difference in inflation. You could do that especially especially for your loyal customers. It could be a loan on cars, on the customer financing. I'm saying 2-3 months because I'm assuming that you would not want to have longer terms. So you could actually have a contract which could be for 3 or 4 months or 2 or 3 months, which focuses on rate of inflation. It's also legitimate to have a discount for early payment. This was also discussed in the past. It has been an issue of contention. The reason for that is that there is one approach which is a rather restrained approach to Islamic finance, and there's a broader approach. So those who approach the issues with a more restrained and constricted approach try to stay away from money. They are worried about too much money making money. So that's the reason why they try to stay away from money, from trade, from banks. So there is a group which tries to judge what the banks are doing in this way, but this is not appropriate because we have to see the facts, irrespective of what the principles are, because principles at the end of the day should be debated. And here, as you see, that the Religious Director of the Fed also says that discounts for early payment is halal. So if an obligor is paying its debt earlier, then that is also possible, and it is possible for the creditor to have or to effect a discount in case the payment is made early. I have another presentation which is about insurance. I don't know if there's anyone from the insurance sector here, but I say that we are 180 years late in this area, because 180 years ago, during the later years of the Ottoman Empire, naval insurance was first issued, and there was a discussion about it, and it was said to be haram. And so 180 years went by without any insurance. The Sheikh al-Islam, the highest top religious person, says that insurance is not acceptable because there is gharar in it, there is gambling in it. But now the religious directorate, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, is saying that it is acceptable. So we lost a lot in those 180 years. We could have had so many companies, we could have had companies 180 years old. I don't know how old the participation banks are here. 20 years, Al-Baraka Türk may be one of the oldest, but that's so few years compared to the 180 years that went by. There is a lot of discussion about what interest means in Islamic law. So what do we call faiz or interest? What do we not call interest? There's a lot of discussion on that in Islamic law. And I provided a text for this speech, and you will see a lot of information in that text as well. It is for sure that interest is forbidden, but its content is under discussion. The Islamic lawyers are discussing whether there would be interest in the banknote system. I think that it is a transaction based on interest, but it is contentious. So in theology, we see these discussions going on, and these discussions were the case 1,000 years ago. People were looking at the monetary system then. There were copper coins and so on, and there was a lot of discussion about whether there could be any interest on money. But then there are other issues like the difference in inflation and the goods which could be subject to interest, and whether or not there would be any interest on advance payments, whether or not there would be workmanship or quality which should be considered as part of this discussion are also issues of contention. So there's a lot of discussion on what interest entails. And there will be, I think, an almanac for 2016, and I was writing an article there, and I had an article there about the need for case law in Islamic law. So that's why we need to focus more on case law to make a decision on many of these issues. So what am I trying to arrive at? For example, murabaha in the Islamic banking organizations, or if you consider the participation accounts, some people may be criticizing these in light of interest, but we should really be focusing on how we can resolve the fundamental issues here, because we haven't really resolved our fundamental issues yet. That's why we cannot speak about the vehicle support system or the corporate support systems. Those are not the kinds of products that we are able to implement properly, because we still have serious problems with the fundamental understanding. An excessive garar is prohibited. You may have some level of garar, but not broad garar. And a contract could be in writing or verbal. This is the other principle. And the reason, or why I put this in here, is because the following. We have in participation-based banking today a general loan agreement. And based on that agreement, we provide various contracts, lease contracts, istisna contracts, or other contracts. So all of these are done over or through this loan agreement. So we have in writing a single template, and that's a credit contract. So in fact, when you use the word credit, you don't really distinguish between any of these different types of contracts, because we operate on credit, the word credit, and we use the word credit to mean everything, and that's why people who enact this process don't know which contracts they're doing. And I can tell you that Islamic lawyers know about the differences between these different contracts. Like Hayrettin Karaman will know it, and he's able to tell the bank what can be done within the framework of, say, the istisna contract. But when the bank is using or processing that information, they only understand this as allowing them to conduct a credit agreement. So everything is lumped under the word credit. So there has to be some distinction here. That's why we try to use at least a verbal contract to distinguish between these different contracts, like wakalet, etc. But we must do is to ensure that we put everything in writing. So the participation banks should have well-defined in writing all of the procedures for various types of agreements and contracts. Because if we don't do that, then we cannot manage perceptions, because people will not, or their perceptions will not change. Although you might say that you are extending wakala or giving agency, your employee either doesn't know, doesn't understand, or won't say it, and so you think that you have a contract in that way, but in actual fact, everything is done as a credit agreement or credit contract. In Islamic law, you can have verbal and written contracts, as long as what is verbally stated represents the agreement. One of the principal issues in participation banking has to do with accounts, because monies are collected. These funds are collected, and in deposit banks, you have a lending process here, because this is what the principle is based on. There's another perception here which I object to, because some people say that participation banks do not have sufficient products. Well, if you look at the contracts which have been executed, 90% of the conventional banks' transactions are actually extending loans, because repo, the deposits, everything is based on a lending system. The person is lending its money or his money to the bank. So everything is based on a debt contract. So in fact, the deposit banks have a very limited type of product, because they only focus on these debt agreements plus interest, and this is what everything is based on. Whereas in Islamic banking, there are quite a number of different contracts which we can carry out, and all those contracts have various possibilities. but we don't benefit from them. For example, istisna contract can provide us with various possibilities, but we don't look into them. We only confine ourselves to the understanding of a credit agreement, and we only focus on financial profit. So I think that the participation banks here are running in a one-way street, because if you think of yourself as doing everything that the conventional banks do through through their agreements in an Islamic form, then we will never catch up with the conventional banks, because we would have to always follow them. So participation banks must certainly provide their clients with a number of different alternatives. So whatever the salam contract is providing you with, or the istisna contract is providing you with, or any forward or future contracts are providing you with, you have to make use of them. Or they may be different types of opportunities in a sarf contract. So these are the kinds of areas which we have to focus on. We have to focus on their particularities. For private current accounts, for the customers are not aiming at providing loans to the bank when they open a special current account, right? When they go to a participation bank, the client goes to a participation bank, and is it their intention to provide loans to the bank? No. What they do is they put their money in custody with the bank so that they can get certain services from the bank, and they want to keep their money in the bank. They want to be able to have access to their money through the internet or through the ATMs and so on. So in fact, from the point of view of the customer, the issue here is the provision of certain services, and this is a unique contract. Of course, this would also be true for the demand deposits that exist in conventional banks. From the point of view of the bank, on the other hand, we see that banks consider these monies as a source of financing. So although their customers may not have that kind of an intention, the banks have that intention because the bank uses that money. So from the point of view of the bank, we're looking at a debt contract. Yes, it's free resources. From the point of view of the owner of the account, these are usually considered to be a vedia or a service provision or a unique exclusive contract. So we usually try to confine the definition of these contracts with one or two types of contracts, whereas we should be expanding our understanding of contracts, because we have to know that there are different needs, and we should be able to cater to those needs. We say that from the point of view of the banks, this is lending, it's cars, and if the account holders wish to have access, of course they can have access to their monies through the internet or through the ATMs. So of course there are certain rules whereby some of the money is kept in the bank for central bank regulations, and that's why some of it is in custody. They also have precious mineral accounts, for example, gold or silver. So there are contracts in that area as well. These have to involve advance payment, and once the gold is provided, then it is also recorded in the accounts, and then it could be kept by the bank. It is some sort of a vedia contract in that sense, and I think you can use the gold accounts in a more limited fashion. Then you keep them as a vedia, but if you're able to make use of some of that gold, then they become a car's process or transaction. Participation accounts. These are based on the mudaraba. I know time is limited, so I'm trying to run fast and I'm missing some parts. I see people are growing a little tired, so I'm trying to finish off in time. Let me say that participation banks could have a new mode for their current accounts, or participation accounts, because the participation accounts currently are based on mudaraba. But what kind of a mudaraba contract is this? We put the money in the bank, and the bank operates that money and shares the profit with us. Whereas the bank is actually placing the profits it has made 3, 4, 5 years ago from previous contracts. So, because if I go to a participation bank, I go there today, but when I get profit a month later, in fact, that profit is also supported by the profits made by the bank in other contracts in previous years. So, the participation banks are not able to follow up daily and distinct profitability. They only look at the pool, and they have to depend on what profitability the pool produces. However, since we say that rate of inflation is not interest, there could be an account stylized after the rate of inflation. Participation accounts are usually 31 days minimum, so you can have other types of accounts which could actually be for shorter periods of time based on the rate of inflation. So that could be one other new contract. I don't want to go into details, but I could also talk about its details later on. For sukuk, there could be different types of sukuk accounts. These would be investment funds, and they could be made into an account. And so there could be new contracts which could be used for the participation accounts. And now let's talk about what we have. We have participation accounts currently, and they're based on mudarabe. This is basically what the principle they're based on. But there could be many more. And there's no problem with the legitimacy of the mudaraba, because this is one of the basic contracts that we have, so it's possible to transact such agreements and contracts, and there are benefits from that for the participation banks. But like I said previously, however, my experience of the last 12 years and experience of others for maybe more than that, for 30 years, show that the presence of the participation banks is a problem. I think this should not be the only thing that's available in a participation bank, because the client should have or should be able to choose from 4, 5, 6 different alternatives. Even the participation accounts in themselves can have differences based on various ways of calculating the returns. So the client should be able to make choices there. We couldn't do this so far, and that's the reason why participation banks still are not able to get a lot of share in the markets. This is because we are unable to provide more profitable alternative accounts for our clients. So, mudarebe, I already talked about. What about financial sale and purchase? I am working these days on a dictionary for participation banks. I am trying to think of different concepts to translate these words. We use murabaha, for example, in Turkish as well. Whereas for our society, it means nothing, because murabaha doesn't mean anything. In fact, if you look at the Turkish language organization's website, they translate murabaha as usury. So people would think that we would be engaged in usury. Rebaha is the root in Arabic, and it means profit, and murabaha is based on this. So I have a suggestion in Turkish, finansal alım satım. This is what I'm suggesting to use for the Turkish of murabaha, because there is financial leasing here, and if there's financial leasing, then maybe we can say finansal alım satım in Turkish to mean murabaha, because we're talking about a sale and purchase contract for financial purposes. One of the fundamental issues here is the following. We are engaged in a sale and purchase, but in our legislation there's a different definition. There is a definition of individual loans or corporate loans, and it talks about the bank paying the money for the services that are provided. This, in fact, changes the way we look at our system. So for murabaha, we need to have a definition, and we need to use this definition to explain it. And here I make a suggestion. We can say that murabaha means that the participation banks are providing a loan if they provide the cost of services and goods. And it is not something that is done for today. It's a process which has been ongoing for a long time. Murabaha has been around for a long time, in other words, and we know that it's a legitimate transaction. There's no question about that. Some religious scholars have talked about this. This is 1,200 years ago. One of the most important ulama of the Hanefis makes a commentary and says that if I want to buy a house for 1,000 and you tell me that you can buy it for 1,100, and if the person was worried that the second person would change his mind about buying, what happens? And he talks about the possibility that there could be some consignment system which could be used. So we call this the muhayyer system, and he says that this should be done, this transaction could be done in consignment. So the banks actually are there, the system is there, in other words, and you see it 1,200 years ago. And in 2016, it's a problem to get some Islamic scholars to accept this, whereas it was already in place 1,200 years ago. So sometimes it's very difficult to get people to accept it today. There are lease or the sukuk agreements, and here we are looking at the manfaat, and there could be payments in advance or payments in installments. Therefore, participation banks can focus on this. They can focus on the sale of services. This could be in various areas, like there could be certain transactions in education, health, or construction, and those could also be considered under this item. There are also there's also financial leasing. Is this a new contract? Is it a regular leasing process? These are the kinds of discussions going on between Islamic lawyers, but I believe that this is a new type of contract, and it can be organized specifically in that way. There are certain responsibilities of the leaser and lessee here. There was reference to IOF standards previously by the previous speaker. I think some of those standards should be debated or debatable, as he himself, the previous speaker, said. The countries amend these standards according to their circumstances. So these are the kinds of things we have to focus on. I am one of the two persons who translated the IOF standards, and I can tell you that they are not absolutely binding. They shouldn't be absolutely binding. I have made explanations in this respect, and we should not take them as is. Tavarruk is also another issue, and we see that tavarruk is a way that can be used through international markets to gain some financing, and in some cases certain things are not or cannot be conducted through other methods, legally speaking, and that's why tavarruk is resorted to. And my view is that if a commodity is to be bought or sold from whichever exchange, and you need to have a process there, then this would be, tavarruk would be a way out. Especially if there is a need, then you should really focus on this, because if people have difficulty, if you don't engage in this activity and there will be bigger problems, then participation banks ought to find ways to help resolve these difficulties. Sometimes people call me and say they need money, they have a check, but they need such and such an amount of cash, and they cannot go to any participation bank to do this. Why? You might say, you're in the advisory boards, why don't you, or is it you who prevents it from happening? Well, I can say that sometimes the advisory boards are actually doing much more than the banks themselves. They are much more advanced in their thinking. But the banks sometimes they shy away from carrying out some of the things that could help their customers. And so participation banks must certainly try to help their clients resolve their problems. There's also spot exchange transactions in the treasury departments, and this is true for gold accounts as well. There's no problem in this area. This is based on a SARF contract. For promise-based futures exchange transactions, there's again no problem there either, because these are all watt-based, promise-based. These are forward swaps. I know that these are not a lot in terms of the number of transactions carried out, but they can engage in this. So I tried to speak through all this, and at the very beginning of my speech, I had listed most of the contracts that are carried out by Islamic banks. I just wanted to give you some basic information about these contracts. Thank you for your attention. I hope that this was helpful. Thank you.